This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We are in the midst of Tarkir Dragonstorm preview season, and as usual, in the weekend after the first week of preview season, I'm doing a video here where I'm going to take a look at the set's mechanics, talk about how I think they'll perform, and talk about how they will work. The set review, the full set review, where I'll be looking at every single card in the set, will start on Friday of next week and conclude on Monday, probably. Also, if you'd like to get some set review related perks, you can become a channel member or a patron. And if you do, you get access to my ongoing notes during preview season. It's kind of a rough draft of what my set review ultimately becomes. And once the set review is complete, you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of the grades from the set review. So if those things interest you, check out the description. You can find out how to be a channel member or a patron if you do. All right, so let's dive right in. We have a bunch of new mechanics in this set. Not too surprising, I guess, because it is a faction set, right? This set is mostly based around 3 color combinations, in particular the wedges, the same ones from original Tarkir. So this is a multicolored focused set, like in a big way. And we've got 5 guild mechanics, but there are also 2 other new mechanics, and I want to cover the non-faction mechanics first, because these are going to show up on lots of cards in the set, not just cards in a particular color combination. So let's start with Omen. So this is a new mechanic that at first glance kind of looks like adventure. I think there is a reasonable chance that at your pre-release somebody is going to assume this is an adventure because the frame is so similar, but they're not. They're a little bit different. They are also similar, so this is like adventure, a spell subtype. You can see here on Purging Stormbrood, it has Absorb Essence, where you would expect to see an adventure. For 1 generic and a white, it says Instant Omen. So the difference is that when you cast the Omen side here, the card gets shuffled into your library. So instead of it getting exiled and then you can cast the creature later, you do lose the card. It goes into your deck, but you might redraw it later. Obviously, this is substantially worse than Adventure. Adventures often are set up in such a way that it's hard not to get a 2-for-1 out of them, because you get to play the Adventure side, and then you can play the other side later in the game. It'll be available to you for the rest of the game until you play it, the creature side. That won't always happen here. So you do use up a card in a very real way if you decide to cast Absorb Essence. But you can redraw it later and choose to play either side, right? Once again, just like you could the first time you had it in your hand. So these are a lot more modal than adventures are in that sense, because you don't get both halves. You only get one side or the other each time you get this card. And I like the way the modality works on most of these. You know, there are several of them that are just purely monocolored, but it looks like there's at least one uncommon that will be in each 2-color combination, like Purging Stormbrood here, who, you know, the Absorb Essence side is a pretty good combat trick. 2 mana for +2/+2 lifelink and hexproof. You'll use that when things line up for you to use it, whether it lets you save a creature or win combat. And especially in the early game, when you may not have the mana for a while to cast this as a creature anyway. And then when you really need a creature and you have the mana, you can just slam this 5 mana 4/4 flyer on the board. You know, it has a couple of other abilities that are not that exciting, but they do something. You know, it's got ward and removes counters, and counters is a big theme, especially in Abzan, as we'll see. So it's going to come up. But, you know, neither side of this would be like an incredible card on its own, but they'd both be kind of playable, and having them both together is nice modality to have. But remember, not adventure. It's substantially worse in terms of power level, and it also, you know, makes sure people at your pre-release, the people who are going in kind of blind, realize that this is an Omen and not an adventure. So let's look at Behold now. This mechanic is something we've seen before. It's just been given a name. In fact, we saw it in original Tarkir block, used in the exact same way. So, for example, Caustic Exile here says, as an additional cost to cast a spell, Behold a Dragon, or pay 1 generic. And to Behold a Dragon, you reveal one from your hand, or choose one you already have in play. It lets you choose between 2 different zones, which is nice. You know, cards that only let you do the thing when you have a dragon in play, or only if one's in your hand, are substantially worse. But this lets you do either one. It's likely that the only behold we'll see in this particular set is dragon. It's not impossible we see other things. It can work with any quality on a card. You know, we could potentially see behold an instant or whatever, right? Obviously, in that case, it'd have to be in your hand, but still, you can behold anything. And this shows up across all of the colors in the set because, you know, dragons are a huge theme in Tarkir Dragonstorm. And this particular card is real good because the baseline is 2 mana for -3/-3. That's already a premium removal spell you would play like 4 copies of in every black deck if you could. And sometimes it's only going to cost 1. So, you know, you can really, really trade up with this thing and cause a lot of havoc. It's going to be a great common. And all of the cards with Behold give you some sort of bonus or discount, in this case, for beholding a dragon. So that's a mechanic we're going to see a lot of across all of the colors, as is Omen. All right, so let's dive into each of the guild mechanics now. There are 5 of them because, you know, there are 5 guilds. I guess they are called clans, right, in this set, not guilds. I keep calling them that. So, yeah, let's look at them. They have the same sort of mechanical identity that they had in the past, each of these 5 cons, but every single one of them got a new mechanic instead of them reusing one or something like that. So let's start with Sultai. So the Sultai mechanic is Renew. So Renew means that if you have a card with it in your graveyard, you can pay a cost and exile that card to give a creature you have in play some quality that that card had. So, for example, Agent of Kotis here, which is a 2 mana 2/1. Once it's in your graveyard, you can pay the renew cost for 3 generic and a blue and exile it to put 2 counters, +1/+1 counters on a creature. You can only activate it as a sorcery. I think that's the case for every renew ability. So these allow you to either, you know, you can play this thing on turn 2, trade it off for their 2-drop, and then later in the game, usually when you don't have anything else to do, you can renew this and make one of your creatures into a bigger threat. So you end up getting pretty good value. As usual, with like most graveyard mechanics, in terms of efficiency, like it's not amazing, right? If you just had a card that was 4 mana, put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature at sorcery speed, that's an awful card. But you get more value than that out of this card in most cases because you can play it as a creature first, and it gives you something to do with your mana later in the game, something that is relatively meaningful. Furthermore, you know, Sultai is about the graveyard more broadly. This is a graveyard mechanic, of course, and so you're going to be milling yourself, and being able to get value out of cards that mill because you can use their renew abilities is pretty good. So this is a nice graveyard value mechanic. We've also seen a rare that is basically Vampire Nighthawk on steroids that can give all of those same keywords, Flying, Lifelink, and Death Touch to something from out of the graveyard. So that's another example of how this works. It gives its keywords, whereas Agent of Kotis sort of gives its power to whatever it is that you have in play that you're renewing onto. And for each of these color combinations, you know, if you've played a 3-color format before, I guess the last one was Streets of New Capenna, most of the time you are predominantly in like 2 colors, but mana is good enough in a format like this that you're usually going to splash the 3rd color, and you have a lot of incentive to do it. This set has a whole bunch of commons that are 3 colors, it has uncommons that are 3 colors, and so, you know, it's a little more than a splash. You're not usually going to be full on 3 colors. I mean, you can be if you get really good mana, and there is good mana in the set. But most of the time, you're going to be predominantly in 1 2-color combination and have like 4 or 5 cards from the other color from the clan. Like, for example, with Agent of Kotis, you might be in a blue-green deck and splashing black, and, you know, you're in Sultai. But it's like a big splash. Maybe splash isn't even, you know, the right word. But it'll be interesting to see how they divide up these color pairs. But all of the Sultai color pairs are going to be graveyard oriented. That much is obvious, and all of these renew mechanics are going to work pretty well. All right, next up, let's look at the Jeskai mechanic this time around. They have Flurry. So Flurry is a mechanic that triggers whenever you cast or have cast a 2nd spell each turn. So as usual, Jeskai's into spells. It is worth noting that it's not just instants and sorceries, though, like past Jeskai mechanics have been. Rather, it doesn't care what the spells are. It is true that, generally speaking, it's easier to double spell with instants and sorceries because they often draw you a card or whatever. But you can play a creature and then play a combat trick right? And get Flurry kind of out of nowhere, sort of like you can with Prowess. It takes a little more setup. For example, here on Jeskai Devotee, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn when you cast your second spell each turn. So it can become a 3/3 out of nowhere, sort of like Prowess. This mechanic isn't one I like really love, that I have like really high hopes for. Prowess, would just be way better. Like if they were gonna bring one back, I feel like that might have should been the one. It's just hard and limited to consistently Flurry. They're going to have it set up so you can do it. 1-mana spells that are cantrips and stuff will set it up. Even like cards that are 2-mana 1/1 draw a card will help you set things like this up. But it's still pretty tough to trigger this consistently. Like, you shouldn't count on triggering this every turn or even close. Like, the ideal thing to do is have a few cards with Flurry in play, and then have a turn where you double spell, and then get a bunch of things to buff. But that's also not always easy to set up. I mean, I don't think it's a bad mechanic. I just don't see it as being something that's, the mechanic we just looked at, Renew, like, all that has to happen is a card has to go to the graveyard and you get value. I mean, you have to pay a cost too. But this asks a little bit more of you. We'll see how it pans out. There are some powerful payoffs for it, of course. And there are some cards that sort of help you set it up all on their own. Like there's a 4-mana 2/4 that does the red card draw thing. Exile the top card. You can play it on your next turn. And it has Flurry, gain double strike. So because it sort of draws you a card, it can help you set it up so it has double strike. But, those are the ones that are probably going to be the best. The ones that are just pure Flurry cards that don't help you Flurry are less good. That said, with Jeskai Devotee, I wanted to show you this card too because it's part of a cycle. We always get like a common cycle in these 3-color sets that really helps you with your mana, in addition to having like, dual lands. This cycle overall looks pretty good. The creatures are all like passable or a little bit better. And they all filter your mana into the colors of your 3-color combination. And you can even play them like, in other combinations. Like if you're playing Teamer, sometimes Jeskai Devotee will help you with your mana too. So, so that's Flurry, and this cycle is also one to keep an eye on. They're all relatively cheap creatures who are good at fixing your mana and have a solid baseline. All right, let's move now to Abzan, where the mechanic is Endure. So Endure is always accompanied by a numerical value, as you can see on Fortress Kinguard here. And you can trigger Endure in a number of ways. On Fortress Kinguard, it's an Enters trigger. On the new Anafenza, it's a Death trigger. But either way, you get to choose between two things whenever you have a card Endure. And that is that you either get the same number of +1/+1 counters, or a creature with the same power and toughness as the Endure value of the card. So for Fortress Kinguard, this is modal. It's either a 2-mana 2/3 or a 2-mana 1/2 that makes a 1/1. This is a really good common. Like 2-mana 1/2 make a 1/1 is a very, very good Magic card, and not even really just in limited. Like that's a pretty good rate, and that's what you're going to want to do most of the time. Making extra bodies is typically better in limited than putting a counter on a thing. But it's nice that it has that modality, plus Abzan has this identity as being into counters to some extent, and being into going wide a little bit. And you can see that the mechanic here lets you kind of do both. I wouldn't be surprised if the way it breaks down for this particular 3-color combination is like green-white is into going wide or into +1/+1 counters, and then like black-green is into the other. Probably the black-green would be more into counters and green-white would be more into going wide, in terms of how those color pairs have worked in the past. But you can see how they would sort of divide the color pairs here. But yeah, this mechanic looks pretty strong to me overall. Like this kind of modality is great. It gives you whole bodies that you get to add to the board, and that's always a powerful thing in limited. Like you can get a token, and sometimes a pretty real token, depending on the Endure value. That's just really good value, and this is just a great 2-drop, and it's got a good chance of just being white's best common in the set. All right, let's move to Teamer now. Here, the mechanic is Harmonize. So this one's interesting. Teamer in the past has been into high power, and it still is. There are some cards in the set that check for power specifically, including the Harmonize mechanic. So if a card has Harmonize, it has a casting cost you can pay when it's in the graveyard. And in addition, or not in addition, but when you cast it, you can choose to tap a creature you have in play, and that harmonized cost gets reduced by X generic, where X is that creature's power. So it's a high power mechanic. Like we have Ureni's Rebuff here, which when you first cast it, it's 2 mana to bounce a creature, and then you can harmonize it from the graveyard and tap a 4 power creature and pay 2 again. So you end up paying 2 twice to bounce a creature. This is kind of interesting to me. Temur isn't usually like a graveyard deck. I could, blue-green sometimes is a graveyard deck, and maybe that's the color pair within Temur that'll be more into that, while red-green will be way more into 4 power or high power specifically. But obviously this mechanic works in both styles of decks, whether you're a graveyard deck or a high power deck. And any card that lets you cast it from the graveyard, it's like the Renew mechanic we saw, gives you something to do with your mana, especially later in the game. And Rebuff looks like a solid card, 2 mana to bounce something, a creature specifically, at sorcery speed. That's pretty mediocre these days. You go down a card for maybe a little bit of tempo, but the tempo's not even that great because it's a sorcery, can only hit creatures. But the fact you can cast it again later and sort of rebuy that effect to allow you to have a better attack or something is pretty good. And you don't have to tap anything. Like, you can just pay 6, and sometimes that's going to be best, especially with this card, because you just want to be able to attack with everything after you bounce their creature. So yeah, it's a nice graveyard mechanic that also likes high power. It does feel a little weird to me, but depending on how the specific color pairs break down, it may end up working out okay. But, being a graveyard mechanic that, so far at least, we've only seen appear on instants and sorceries, that also likes you to have a high power creature in play, like, that doesn't line up great, I don't think. But it's, we're early in preview season, it's hard to tell everything right now. And then last, we've got the Mardu mechanic, which is Mobilize. You can see it here on Reigning Victor. So it's got Mobilize 1, so this always has a numerical value. And when a creature with Mobilize attacks, you create that many 1/1 Red Warrior creature tokens, that many being, the Mobilize value, and you sacrifice those at the beginning of the next step. So when Reigning Victor attacks, you get a 1/1 that's tapped and attacking alongside it. So Mardu is into going wide, but it looks like the best, it's like temporarily going wide, right? So it's not the kind of going wide we usually see, but there's also a pretty hefty sacrifice theme. And especially in black-red, probably, that's where we usually see that, right? If you can get these things in, hit your opponent with them, and then sack them for value, that's going to feel insane sometimes. Like, we've seen enough really strong sacrifice decks in Limited where if you can consistently have expendable bodies, the deck's kind of nuts. And Mobilize as a mechanic is everywhere in this 3-color combination, and that means you're going to have lots of expendable bodies. Now, oftentimes they do have to survive combat for you to, sacrifice it to a creature or something in the second main phase, but not always. And Reigning Victor, also has an enters trigger, the +1/+0 indestructible. When it enters, it gives something that, that ability has kind of underwhelmed. You don't always have a way to take advantage, but it's pretty nice. So yeah, those are the 5 mechanics for the guilds. We can sort of see how it'll break down into individual color pairs to some extent. Red-white, probably more into going wide, while black-red, more into sacrifice. But Mardu as a whole is kind of into both of those things. But another thing about Reigning Victor is that it has a returning mechanic, importantly, and that is hybrid mana. We've seen hybrid mana pretty recently, but I don't think we've seen this kind of hybrid mana in like a standard release set in a while. And that is, instead of it being 2 different colors of mana, you can choose between paying a color of mana or 2 generic. And that means, you can pay 4 for Reigning Victor if you're missing one of the colors, 2 generic, a red and a white, for example. But you can also, mix and match. You can pay 6 for it if you have to. Not a very good card when you're doing that, but that is how it works. And there's a cycle of these at common, of course, that are all going to be pretty solid cards. The Victor's not like insane or anything, but it's a solid card that will work in your Mardu deck. And paying 4 for it's not a complete disaster, though you would like to pay 3. There are also sagas in the set, but at this point we see them all the time. I don't really think I need to explain them again, and I think there's only one rare one in each color, in each 3-color combination, so it's not even a huge part of the set. So yeah, those are the mechanics, mostly brand new ones or, spins on things we've seen before. I think overall, the set looks pretty sweet. These multicolored sets tend to be pretty fun. Just because there's so much different stuff you can do, and being able to play 3 colors all the time is refreshing. Hopefully, we don't end up in a situation, though, like the last 3 color set, which was New Capenna, where, like, the Bant colors were just way better than everything else. Hopefully, things are a little more balanced here. I do think the mechanics overall look pretty cool. The ones that I have, like, the highest hope for are probably Mobilize and Endure. They both just give you some serious value and some synergy at the same time, and I think that looks pretty appealing. All right, so that'll do it for this video. There won't be a Needs and Notes next week, but that's because I'll be mid-set review, so there'll be plenty of limited content next weekend to make up for it. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including draft videos, reviews of past sets, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.